welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. Well, we've been at it here for, that's me, and when I say we, I mean me, the dog Lolo and the cat Smudgy have been at this for nearly a year. This show is now on episode 47. I think we may have to have a party when I get to week 52. We'll see. Anyway, but nearly congratulations to the Human Ascension with Ellie show, because a year is a pretty good run. And we've covered lots of different topics. So there have been many. But you know, the funny thing is, I'm actually finding patterns in the things that I talk about every week. And it means that it's getting to the point where it might be a really good idea to kind of do a summary show. And that's a little bit like what I'm going to be doing today, with a few other new things thrown in as well, just to kind of give us an idea of what we have found so far on this show. So Human Ascension with Ellie began as a radio show that was going to look for evidence about how humanity can expect to evolve in the future, because that's why it's called Human Ascension with Ellie. And what we could possibly discover that would help us to improve our chances when it comes to evolving in a positive way. In order to do that, we kind of have to understand where we've come from. We need to draw from the past and understand in more detail what brought us to where we are today, which then helps us to be able to interpret our current environment, our current concept and perceptions of reality. And also it'll help us then to be able to know what to expect from the future, and perhaps even provide us with clues on how to direct ourselves in a positive way. I started off with the very first show with episode 1. I started off by looking at a fellow called Plato, who lived in the 4th century BC. I was looking at the ancient philosophy that helps us to understand where we are today and where we came from. So Plato, his teacher was Socrates, who is another name that probably sounds familiar. And Plato was one of the world's, and still is, one of the most enduring of the world's philosophers. His theory about the ancient civilization of Atlantis is something that I talked about in episode 1. And his descriptions, Plato's descriptions of Atlantis, appear in 2 of his written works. The first one is a work called Timaeus, actually, I think it's Timaeus. And he talked about a powerful and highly advanced civilization that he says existed somewhere in around about the 10th century BC. It was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, is the wording that I believe he used. But now we know that as being the Gulf of Gibraltar, which is an 8-mile wide passage of water that connects southern Spain to northern Morocco. Atlantis was depicted as an island paradise with orderly, well-planned cities, with brilliant engineers, and it enjoyed a rich soil environment. It had magnificent architecture and a wealth of natural resources. The Atlanteans worshipped the sea god, which I think is interesting. And the sea god is known as Poseidon. They built a temple actually dedicated to being able to worship Poseidon. And in the early days, Atlanteans were actually almost godlike themselves. They had profound psychic abilities, and they had a very close and intimate relationship with their divine spirit. The second work that Plato incorporated into what was supposed to be a trilogy, I understand, was his work called Critias. Critias, goodness. And seamlessly, this kind of began as a continuation of his previous work. Plato's work was written in narrative style, part 1 being named after the narrator, a Pythagorean philosopher by the name of Timaeus. In Critias, Plato detailed descriptions about Atlantis and its geography, its politics, and the society at large. He described it as an island that was arranged in concentric circles, in concentric rings that alternated water and land. And the effect was visually stunning, but it also acted as a good defense against possible invasion, because an invader would have to get through a body of land and then a body of water and then a body of land, and the defense of that civilization would have been helped by the fact that it's hampering the quick progression of an invasion from an outside force. So it was really quite clever. But in part 2 of Plato's works, Atlantis starts to take a dark turn, and the Atlanteans grew morally corrupt, which I think often is the case for civilizations or societies or even just families and individuals who live a pretty comfortable, stress-free life. They start to expect certain things and then it all starts to fall apart. But the Atlanteans grew morally corrupt and greedy, leading to a downfall of their civilization in a variety of different ways. They became aggressive and militaristic, and they craved an endless conquest of other parts of the world. In Plato's story, Atlantis was ultimately defeated by ancient Athens. And he described Athens as being kind of a virtuous and honourable society in which the virtue and justice and wisdom prevailed. It should be noticed, however, that Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher, and so maybe he was a little biased in his opinion. And theories also exist that his works were often allegories for his political viewpoints. So this could be something that, he slanted towards because of his politics. There's also a possibility that he was forced to give the Athenians a happy ending and to give high praise to his own political ancestry, because philosophers were often murdered back in those days, hundreds of years ago, by the controlling forces that governed if they stepped too far outside of what was considered to be acceptable philosophy. That's exactly what happened to Socrates, Plato's mentor. Socrates was killed by the current status quo, because his theories were just considered to be a little bit too unorthodox for that status quo, and they challenged the status quo. So the philosophers sometimes had to be very clever about the way that they worded things so that they could inform and enlighten those that followed their work without unnecessarily insulting the powers, that particularly those that had the power to murder them in their sleep or accidentally feed them some poison or something like that. And actually, I think that's how Socrates died. He was poisoned in the end. So according to Plato, ultimately Atlantis was destroyed as a result of ethical degradation, divine retribution, cataclysmic weather events and ongoing calamities, and maybe even self-destruction as a result of advanced technology that went wrong and things like that. And of course wars as well. Some of the events appear to mirror the stories that appear in the Book of Enoch as well, which I've also covered on this show, I think a few episodes after episode 1 where I was talking about Plato. So in the Book of Enoch, just a really quick summary, God sent his sons to watch over humanity and the earth. But they became smitten with the earthly women because apparently we were pretty special back then. And so they corrupted humanity. They took the women as wives and they had children with them that were considered the Nephilim. These were the giants who ultimately ate people in the end and caused a lot of calamities around the earth. So they corrupted humanity, and wars and divine retribution and catastrophes ensued until civilization was destroyed and humanity had to start again. Plato used the two works that I'm talking about today as a way to warn people of the harms of losing our way. He narrated in somebody else's name in order to be able to say things that might get him murdered if it were in his own name. And so that's why I think that a lot of the time he was challenging the status quo but trying to do it in a way that wouldn't cause him any harm. The concept of Atlantis sat within a wider context of discussion on the creation of reality, which included the Earth and the universe and the evolution of humanity. It detailed discussions of the cosmos, metaphysics, ethics, and the moral dilemmas that humans often face on a micro and on a macro scale. Much of what Plato taught us still endures, and it still continues to guide our understanding of reality today. He is estimated to have died in around 360 BC. So, that's saying something. That's a very long time ago, so around nearly 2,500 years ago. And his works were meant to be part of a 3-part trilogy. At least that's what people seem to think. But the third part was it's never been found. So it was either never written or it has been lost or destroyed. I might actually do a reading, Ask the Cards, on the Ellie Dreams Down Under channel this week about that third part and see what the cards say. Did it actually get written? Was it intended to be written? Did it get lost? Will it be discovered one day? I mean, there are still layers and layers of history under the ground, particularly in parts of the world where, think places like India and Egypt, and maybe even in Australia, where some of the older civilizations have been built over with new civilizations. And we're finding new things all the time, so you never know. We might find this mysterious third part to a trilogy, and perhaps it will tell us all about our future. So Plato and the other philosophers from the ancient world sort of raise questions about what is humanity, who are we? And knowing our origins is really the key to knowing our present and our future. So I've continued on that path of investigation. I mean, I'm no ancient philosopher, but I'm trying to build a body of evidence that's quite casual, and it could go in any direction. And so I'm looking at a wide variety of sources. Sometimes I look at things like psychology, and sometimes I look at politics or current affairs. I look at spirituality. I look at the issues of disclosure and technology and the ET question. And I'm not trying to be an expert in anything in particular. I just want to be able to look at everything with fresh eyes without claiming to be an expert, to see if I can figure out how it might intertwine or create a narrative of what might be our ultimate truth. And of course, that means looking at the ages of humanity as they're speculated to have taken place, things like astrology and other forms of divination or spirituality and the occult, and also science as well, and kind of looking at pretty much everything, and religion and faith and all kinds of questions. So I want to remind us of another episode that I covered early on in the show, and that was relating to the ages of humanity. And today I'm going to be looking at it from the ages of the Golden Age, the Silver Age, Bronze, Stone, and then the Age of Heroes, and of course the Iron Age as well. Science appears to have discovered that humanity in some form has been on Earth for around 2.5 million years. That's science. And it's broken up, according to the ancient philosophers, into those ages. The Stone Age is one in which, prehistoric kind of man, this is speculated to be just after the dinosaurs died out, and then the early ape-like man of the evolutionary theory existed. If we take that at face value, we appear to have developed a cognitive kind of advancement at some point. It was a very slow progression. Maybe just the invention of fire or something about 1 million years ago was enough to sort of keep us going. But it didn't lead to very much in terms of being able to advance further. And if we think of us having first existed at least 2.5 million years ago, well, it was only until around 50 to 60,000 years ago, so only very recently in the scheme of things, that there was a sudden leap in advancement. It kind of exploded out of nowhere. We started using some very basic tools like spears to hunt or fish. It quickly began to develop into more advanced tools. And then within 30 to 40,000 years, there's evidence of a highly advanced engineering that took place. Understanding, also an advanced understanding of the cosmos, of astrology, of astronomy, advanced understandings of how to harness the world's resources. And that leads me to an age that is considered to be one of the earliest in a cycle of ages, and that is the Golden Age, which is also the age that is speculated to be the age of the civilization of Atlantis. Now, some consider this to be a mythical age. If you do a search on the internet and ask about the Golden Age, you will probably get a response that says it's a mythical age that existed. Well, the Golden Age is an age that is dated back to around about 10,000 years ago. And if we're talking about the ages of humanity in a cycle, then it kind of goes around and around. It goes golden, silver, bronze, iron, and then it starts to travel back upward into bronze, silver, and then gold again. And it stays in that age and progresses through the age for a certain thousand number of years. So the Golden Age is expected to be around about 10,000 years long, and it occurs once in that cycle, whereas the Silver Age is a shorter age, but it occurs twice because it's either coming down from the Gold Age or going up towards the Gold Age, depending where in the cycle you are. Evidence exists that shows that some of the most sophisticated artifacts in places like India or Egypt are much older than they've been officially dated. Science, archaeology, tends to date these things at around about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And that includes things like the Sphinx or the pyramids in Egypt. But others, more sophisticated sampling of the soil demonstrates a dating that could be actually much older than that, particularly when it comes to the Egyptian major artifacts like the Sphinx or the pyramids. They demonstrate that somewhere around the period of the Younger Dryas or the Great Flood even, these structures already existed at that time, and you can see the watermarks from levels of water having risen and then receded, and they're estimated to be around about 10,000 years ago at least. And so they were quite advanced for the time, because it's even difficult to understand how they could be built today, some of these structures. So the Egyptian pyramids are speculated by many to be some kind of an engineering marvel that were virtually impossible to create, but they were built to perfect alignment, not only structurally speaking, but also with relation to the cosmos and the planetary lineup of the time. There has been a slight shift in the Earth's polar alignment in the cosmos, which means that the pyramids may be off by 1 degree or something like that, but at the time that they were built, they were exact, they were perfect. And so you wonder how this could have been possible in a civilization that wasn't advanced, but also what was the purpose of that perfection. And so there have been those that are of the impression quite strongly that those structures, in particular the pyramid structures, were built that way for the purposes of conducting energy with sufficient power to be able to power an advanced civilization, possibly even the entire world. And that there were other civilizations similar to Atlantis elsewhere in the world that have also ultimately been destroyed. But people believe that the Golden Age was the age of that time when humanity lived in peace and harmony and abundance and without labor also. So they didn't build these structures physically. And so if they didn't build them physically, how did they do it? They used some kind of supernatural power, something that is beyond the natural laws as we understand them, or as science understands them. Because if you are more of a spiritual person, then you probably understand it just a little bit differently than science. There's artistry written or carved into the walls of ancient Egypt that appear to show building processes taking place in which some kind of energy is being harnessed by either people or godlike creatures. And it's been speculated that this may have been some kind of an energetic manipulation like levitation that allowed the people and the builders of the pyramids to be able to lift these massive multi-ton blocks without physically having to touch them. And this is kind of, it's not hard and firm scientific evidence, but there is no other type of explanation. And when you have these ancient rock carvings that appear to demonstrate blocks of stone that are surrounded by some kind of an energy field and then lifting off the ground with people poised towards them but not touching them in the carving, it's quite a clear message that something else was happening other than your typical construction, physical, tangible construction method taking place. And this is all something that feeds into the theory of there being some kind of a golden age that was a utopian time in which reality was an entirely different kind of thing. So humans have lived for thousands of years across many ages. And the golden age is an example in which they've done that for a long time with mysterious consequences. But the people of that time also appeared, if the artwork is anything to go by, to have their own set of gods, including sun gods, or if you want to rephrase that, sons of God, or God's sons. Now, a sun god obviously relates to the sun in the sky, but a sun is quite a coincidental kind of thing to interpret in the English language as well when it comes to faith and religion, particularly when they have a golden halo and they appeared to come from the light and the sun, and there's all of these coincidences. So it appears that there was a son of God or a god of sun-like or a sun god in existence in each of these ages, and the Golden Age is no exception to that. But somehow that reality from that age turned sour, and there was a divine intervention that occurred, wiping out the early advancements that humanity had enjoyed. And so a little bit like losing its knowledge or losing its wisdom, the Golden Age ended with some kind of a catastrophe and the Silver Age began. And it's likely that the Silver Age was a rebuilding of the earth and humanity and civilization following some kind of a major cataclysmic type of event, like a giant flood of biblical proportions or some other kind of catastrophe. All the faith cultures have stories of a great flood, including the indigenous cultures all across the world. Actually, it doesn't matter where you go. There are stories of there being a massive flood that wiped out all of humanity as a punishment for some kind of corruption that occurred within that humanity or within that civilization. And there was only a skeleton crew of humans that were allowed to survive for the purposes of rebuilding, and also whose role it was to repopulate the earth. No pressure at all. I mean, I feel sorry for Noah. He must have spent an awful lot of time, let's just say, resting in order for there to be 8 billion people now. But, he managed to do the job. That's all right. So some of the knowledge of the previous age may have been retained through memory, but because a lot of the skill and the wisdom was killed, then they would have to start again in lots of ways as well. And a lot of that wisdom was lost. And so the utopian perfection no longer existed. It had been in decline. And so, of course, the Silver Age occurred and took place for thousands of years as well. But it didn't quite get to the same advanced level that the Golden Age had. The Silver Age is also considered to be a mythical age, but it does appear in ancient writings as having occurred, which is the reason why I'm treating it as though it occurred, because the fact that science can't find evidence of it doesn't mean that it didn't exist. And as soon as evidence is located, it will exist officially. So humanity's relationship was not as close to the gods in the Silver Age because the way that it's understood from a cosmic standpoint is that the Earth rotates around the solar system in an elliptical movement, which is like an oblong. And so it's not a perfect circle of rotation. And so there are periods of time where it gets closer to its binary star, which is the sun, and times where it's further away. During the times that it's sort of traveling in this oval circle and it's closer to the sun, the magnetic rays or the magnetic field is stronger, and the spirituality of the life force on Earth is also stronger, which means that humanity has a stronger connection to its divine element, and therefore has a closer relationship to its spirit, to its God, and has a more intimate type of spirituality, which may also include more spiritual powers, like things like telekinesis or psychic abilities and things like that. When it moves further away from the binary star, the electromagnetic field changes, and therefore it loses touch. And that's where we see things like the Silver Age degrading down into the Bronze Age and things like that. People become less connected to their spirituality. And I guess that makes sense. If this God concept is connected to the sun and we're further away from the sun, then we may be further away from our spirituality. But once again, there was some kind of a major incident, and this could have been the Great Flood, or it could have been some kind of a major asteroid event, but humanity was wiped out once again. And that led us to the Bronze Age. The timeline of the Bronze Age is much easier to confirm because archaeology and science have proven it. It took place from between around about 3,300 BC to around 1200 BC. And humanity was harnessing the various minerals of the earth at that time, like stone and copper and tin. They were creating weapons and watercraft and temples and palaces. And these are the days of urbanized development like Mesopotamia and Egypt that science have proven. Now, the Mesopotamians have a lot of artwork depicting godlike humanoid creatures arriving from somewhere in the sky or from the oceans. And when they were helping humanity to learn at record speeds. And this is where, these are the periods of time where humanity started to really escalate in its awareness and its knowledge of how to harness the earth and how to build things that we're able to prove through these archaeological finds. Things like alchemy were developing. Astronomy and engineering are confirmed to have been developed during that time, perhaps again because, of course, in the earlier ages it was already supposedly well known, but being rediscovered. And the supernatural arts like mediumship and astrology and things like that were being discovered. This is the time that the Old Testament of the Bible talks about, with great men who lived for hundreds of years, families of people who spread across the earth. This is the story of the Israelites, for example, in that patriarchal list of people that appear in the Book of Names, for example. And some of them had a direct communication line with the gods, or perhaps just the single God, if the Bible is the one that you want to go by. And of course, that's all up to interpretation. But the early languages during that time left a legacy of written works that help us to understand that people of the Bronze Age also worshipped sun gods as well, of a variety of types from time to time as well. And there was references made, for example, in the Bible, but also in the book of Enoch in particular, of giant men, heroes who fought against gods who came like beasts from another world and stuff like that. There's also some of the ancient philosophers that talk about it as well. There were many wars that were fought during the Bronze Age, and I'm blending together the Age of Heroes, which may very well have been talking about these giants as well. And humanity appeared to completely descend spiritually into a kind of an existence that was as far from the Golden Age as you can imagine, or at least it was until we got to the Iron Age. So the Iron Age is the period of time between around 1200 and 1200 BC and 600 AD. And we may even still kind of have remnants of the Iron Age in us now. But this is where the cycle of the ages has moved to the bottom of that oval. And it's where it becomes the darkest. We are as far away from our binary star as we can be. And so, but we're on the upward trajectory back up into a new Bronze Age. Humanity is dark in the Iron Age and warlike and really brutal with savage tendencies. And this is the time when the God that we understand from the Bible came to earth and tried to teach humanity how to create a society that exists today. This is when the rise of the empires like Greece and Rome occurred, and it was during the invent of the Abrahamic religions, including Christianity and Islam and Judaism, the religions that we understand today. It's believed that we have sort of come out slowly of that Iron Age, or we're somewhere in that transition period, and that we are in the early stages of the Bronze Age. And it makes perfect sense that there would be an overlap between the ages because they are transitional. And so there will be elements of the old and elements of the new intermingled, particularly in the beginning of that. And that this transition into the Bronze Age may also be our leaving this age of Pisces that we've been in for thousands of years and transitioning into an age of Aquarius, which is heading up towards an age of greater enlightenment. So I also did a series that occurred just prior to Christmas on Helena Blavatsky and the work that she did. Helena Blavatsky was a Ukrainian mystic who lived in the mid to late 19th century. She was a bit of a feminist maverick who fled the safe confines of her wealthy married life, and she traveled the world in search of esoteric wisdom. She went to India, she ultimately ended up in Tibet, according to her story, and she authored a very famous book called The Secret Doctrine. I did a 3-part series on her. I talked about her life, I talked about the secret doctrine, and I talked about how her wisdom that was published in that book was harnessed and then reinterpreted for the Nazi regime, and how it was completely distorted to suit the purposes of a intolerance and supremacist type of viewpoint. And also political viewpoint, because it was sort of harnessed and then put together in a political coalition of different forces in order to not only fight wars, but also segregate and oppress certain people. However, that wasn't the original intention of the secret doctrine. Helena Blavatsky created a spiritual map of our evolution according to what she says was dictated to her by her ascendant masters. And it still forms, the secret doctrine still forms the bare bones sort of understanding of the spiritual and esoteric beliefs that guide people like you and me today. So when we think of things like spiritualism and a lot of what that contains, we're drawing from the wisdom that Helena Blavatsky brought to the world. The ascendant masters that she believed dictated this secret doctrine and other writings to her are similar to the ascendant masters that the organization Share International continue to speak about in their literature today. I also did an episode on Share International, about 2 or 3 months ago, I think. And ascendant masters are examples of humanity who have transcended beyond the material confines of their existence. So they've earned a place in an ascendant kind of time and place of reality. But, however, they've volunteered themselves to remain on Earth in order to help other humans ascend. And so they're said to embody a special quality which is called the Christ consciousness. And the Christ consciousness is a state of awareness associated with qualities of love and compassion and selflessness. It transcends the boundaries of religion or any other type of belief system. And when a person embodies Christ consciousness, they exhibit unconditional love and unity with all things. It's a level of spiritual awareness that allows a person to recognize their interconnectedness with everything in the universe. People who embody the Christ consciousness demonstrate and promote kindness, understanding, harmony with others and the world around them. They're said to be able to heal others as well. And so I sometimes wonder about a fellow from the current time. His name is Chris Bledsoe, which I covered in episode 1. I also carried on and talked about Chris Bledsoe in a few subsequent episodes about his experiences. And we'll be talking about him a little bit more today as well. He seems to have captured a lot of that Christ consciousness element. He is understood after his experience with an otherworldly type of presence. He appears to have become more aware of his interconnectedness with all things. He's become more compassionate. He seems to want to seek harmony with others, and there are claims that he's been able to heal people as well. And so I do kind of wonder whether he is an example of someone who's kind of caught this Christ consciousness thing. But Jesus is said to have been an ascendant master. And so he, regardless of whether he was the Son of God or just an ordinary man, he was said to have embodied those elements of compassion and self-sacrifice and the promotion of harmony and healing powers and things like that. And there are other people who have been said to be ascendant masters with the same kinds of qualities. For example, Mother Mary is sometimes referred to as an ascendant master. Also in the Buddhist tradition, Kuan Yin is a highly venerated figure that embodied mercy and compassion and the feminine divine, and is said to be someone who often reveals themselves when people, to help people when they're suffering. Similarly, there's an entity called Samat Kumara, who is considered to be an ascendant master that appears in the Hindu philosophy. And Samat Kumara is one of the ascendant masters that Helena Blavatsky actually speaks of in her book, The Secret Doctrine. He features very heavily actually in theosophical writings as a master who is one of 4 sons of the Creator. And the Creator God in Hindu is Brahma. So when you hear the word Brahma in Hindu, this is actually a reference to the Creator God. And Samat Kumara is one of his 4 sons. So Samut Kumara's role is to help humanity to evolve in accordance with its multi-million year cycle of incarnation, development and transition across a variety of planets in the cosmos. So the way that Helena Blavatsky describes it is humanity gets to kind of move around. At the moment, we are in I think it's a 250 million year cycle on Earth. We're around about, I think she said we're around about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through that cycle. And we originated in this carnation on Earth as ethereal bodies ethereal entities that had no body. And we were entities of pure spirit. We didn't have a gender. We had no means of communication. And we were sort of like each a single aspect of a greater soul. With time, we evolved to possess physical bodies, to begin to develop genders and sexuality, and we've kind of learned to be what we have become now. And our continued evolution will ultimately take us full circle back to that ethereal type of element or essence that we began as. And once we achieve that ethereal state, we will then evolve out of our earthly existence. It'll be complete, and we will transition to start another cycle on another planet somewhere out there. So those were the theories. I do far more justice to The Secret Doctrine in episode 2 of the trilogy on Helena Blavatsky. So I would urge you, if you want to understand how that works in more detail, go and listen to the trilogy, because I covered a lot of content in that. So The Secret Doctrine is a book that's about 1,000 pages long, actually. I think it's 1,300 pages long. And it covers a wide spectrum of stuff, like the creation and history of the cosmos, all living things, including plant life, animals, and people, and how everything is interconnected with everything else. And everything is an aspect of a single source creator, which is very much what we believe today. And so it just goes to show how forward-thinking Helena Blavatsky was. If I was going to summarize The Secret Doctrine, I would say that it's a bit like, the easiest way to summarize it is basically with that verse, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, except it's the extended version that takes around 250 million years to unfold. So that then takes me into the Bible. In reality, we currently have 2 different official accounts of our existence. One of them comes from science and one of them comes from religion. And the most prominent religious source of wisdom as to how humanity got here and who we are and what we've done and where we've been and where we're going next is the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, and the Torah. The Bible is broken up into 2 parts. You've got the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in the Old Testament, well, that's the first part of the Bible. It's mostly based on the Hebrew Bible, like I said, and it consists of multiple books and genres in which things like law and history and poetry and prophecy all come together collectively to tell a story about humanity's origins. The book of Genesis is the very first book, and it talks about... Can you hear the bird? I've got the back door open. It's summer, so the birds are very busy these days. And that's where my veggie patch is too, so they're probably eating all my tomatoes. But the book of Genesis is the first book in the Bible, and it talks about the creation of the world. It talks about Adam and Eve, the great flood, Abraham and all of his descendants. We then have important books like the book of Exodus, which talks about the liberation of the Israelites from Egyptian slavery and the 10 Commandments. And then there are other books, the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are also considered to be key books. They talk about the laws and teachings that were given to Israel by God. And then there are other accounts and other books that offer moral and philosophical insights. There's a lot of discussion in the Old Testament about morality and faithfulness to God as a single omnipresent deity residing in heaven and who oversees everything and everyone. And there are similar teachings that appear in the other Abrahamic religious texts, such as the Quran and the Torah, although a few things here and there might be different. And then, of course, after the Old Testament comes the New Testament, which was compiled more recently. And that focuses on the life, teachings, miracles, and healing work in death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and the formation of the early Christian church. It also includes the book of Revelation, which outlines the end of times and how the story of humanity on earth is going to end. You know, so if you're looking for a spoiler alert, just go to the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation for your final answer. When combined, the scriptures of the Old and the New Testament form kind of the cornerstone of Christian faith and theology. The concepts are basically pretty simple, and that is that there are two. Life is a duality, or reality is a duality, and two things exist, and basically it's darkness and light. And Jesus was the light. And failure to follow Jesus is basically a representation of the darkness. And that the light is love and devotion to God. And God, of course, is a fellow who lives in the clouds, who knows everything, can do anything he wants, and unconditionally loves us. So much so that he killed his only son, Jesus, who somehow was a twin, but it was God's only son. I think Mary sort of got double impregnated, but anyway. But he killed his only son, Jesus, in order to forgive our sins. Okay, so he's a guy who lives in the clouds, who knows everything, can do whatever he wants, unconditionally loves us, and to prove it, he killed his son, Jesus, in order to forgive our sins. Except there's a problem with that, and that is that, the whole thing begins to unravel as soon as you start looking at it closely. And so here's why. There are a bunch of secret gospels that were recently discovered in a cave. When I say recently, in the 20th century. They include the Gospels of Mary, Thomas, and others. I've covered the Gospel of Mary, Mary Magdalene, and the Gospel of Thomas not that long ago on this show. I did an episode to each. And also there's this pesky Book of Enoch that forms part of the Dead Sea Scrolls and also appears in the Ethiopian Bible. They were all written, all of these texts were all written at around about the same time as the Bible. In fact, some of them were written prior to other writings that appear in the canonized text of the Bible. But these particular ones were not canonized by the Catholic Church. They were rejected. And people who followed any of those texts were considered to be heretics and were very likely, especially during the period of Constantine, were likely to be murdered, or shortly after, likely to be murdered. They say things that are rejected by the church because they don't shine the church in a positive light. They say, for example, that we shouldn't rely on priests and lawmakers because they are lying to us, and we shouldn't rely on anyone being our intermediaries or buffering our direct connection to this Christ consciousness or to God. And they speak about how the church is lying to us and that everything we need we have inside us. They say that God, or one of them in particular, says that God is simply just one of the Elohim. And Elohim is a plural word for a family of gods, like, for example, maybe the Galactic Federation, right? Except not all of them are pure of heart and loving and fully ascendant, advanced galactic entities. They're a bit more like the Galactic Federation is a bit more like a board of directors of any given corporation out there. Some of them are nice, some of them are not so nice, and they're all at each other's throats because they're all competing for the same validation and resources and workforces or food or whatever. And that Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, was just one of those gods. And for some reason, he ended up being the victorious one, the one that ended up being the ruler of earth for a period of time. And he was awful. He was not at all like the God that's being talked about by Jesus in the New Testament. And so there are questions there. And I know that whenever I read the Bible from a religious standpoint, I'm not religious, but when I read it from the take it at face value religious, there must be some kind of a message here from God, it doesn't make any sense. But when I read it from a galactic federation, God was one of the gods that just happened to, or Yahweh was one of the gods that just happened to be a member of the Elohim that was victorious for a time on earth, then it starts to make sense. But there's also this issue that prevails throughout the Bible about the duality between darkness and light. Darkness and light might just mean daytime and nighttime. And I've done an episode on that as well, which talks about how day fights with night, and sometimes night wins and sometimes day wins. And then this period of Christmas occurs every year because it happens that way in the cosmos. And the Hebrew, the timing of Passover in the Hebrew Bible has been calculated based on the cosmos and the positioning of the sun, and that Easter was arbitrarily stated to be placed certain number of days after Passover and things like that. And it's all based on darkness, physical darkness and physical light. And this is all scientifically verified as well to be occurring constantly. And so these are all things that, we kind of have to question when we're thinking about the darkness and the light. But darkness and light might also mean good versus evil, or it might mean enlightenment versus, or enlightenment and personal power, empowerment, as opposed to following the mainstream, like sheep do. We still kind of need to figure out the details of all of that. But what it does show us is that the Bible, I think, categorically speaking, I can honestly say that I believe that the Bible is not what it is represented to be, not officially. But it is a story about us. And it probably is a story about the truth about us. But it's just been interpreted and changed in sections in order to deflect from the truth. And that it comes from a time when there was more than one God, or whatever people were calling a God, because what is called a God may have actually been something other than a God as we understand a God to be. Those multiple gods that existed at that time were fighting over us, or fighting over earth and us as a resource on earth. And so that makes me wonder what the true purpose of the church is, or what the true purpose of the church was back when it was first created. Jesus may have been a real person. I do suspect that he was a real person, and I think that he was murdered on the cross, just like the Bible says, or thereabouts, but I'm not convinced that his Father made any of that happen. I don't believe that his Father sacrificed him to save us from our sins. I think it's a manipulation that was written into the Bible written into the accounts after the fact, in order to manipulate the events of the time, to help to let powerful people go unacknowledged for their behaviors, and to help us to wrap our heads around the corruption that was taking place at the time. And I believe that the church was created out of corruption, which means that this thing that we see in the world now, the church that we see now, is the legacy of that, which is the reason why it still has pockets of corruption, big fat pockets actually, because it was created right from the very first day out of corruption. A little bit like they say the Australians, us Aussies over here, we all came from being convicts, which is why we're still sometimes a little rough around the edges because of our convict kind of roots. Just, giving you an analogy that hopefully makes some sense. So just as an example, I really can't see any viable reason why every single person that is considered to be righteous by God would have to give up their first and best bit of ox to a priest, unless the priest was corrupted and greedy. Some people say, in justification of that the priests were being, they were volunteering their time to others. And so when you gave the very best and first bit of your ox to the priest was donating it to the community. But there is nothing in the Bible that says that. The Bible doesn't explain that the reason why the priest needs to get the best bit of your ox is because they're giving to the poor. It just says give the best bit of your ox to the priest. To give away the best of whatever you have to either a priest or to a god called Yahweh. And that god Yahweh will respond by torturing you if you take a step in the wrong direction. And it could be torturing you for the rest of your life, simply because you've gone the wrong way. Look at that king. I think his name was King Saul. King Saul, that appears in the Bible. I think Yahweh, if I remember correctly, told Saul to go to war to fight with the Israelites and to murder every single man, woman and child. So King Saul went to war and he won the war, except, he was victorious, except he came home victorious, but without having murdered every single last man, woman and child. And so instead of saying, thanks very much, devoted, righteous man who has done exactly what I told you to do, Yahweh dethroned him and punished him. He had him overthrown by his son, I think. And he punished him for not murdering innocent people. And yet the Bible explains it away as being some kind of an allegory related to true faith and true righteousness. If this is actually a true story, then it's the story of a God who was evil and who wanted people to prove their blind allegiance to him by doing evil things. And so I need to clarify at this point, because when I start talking like this, people start thinking that I'm really anti-church and anti anyone who happens to be clergy, anyone who happens to be a Christian or believer. That's not the case. I don't think everyone in the church is lying to us. I think there are some wonderful ministers, rabbis and other clergy who, in each of the Abrahamic religions, whether it be Judaism, Islam, Christianity, I believe that there are some wonderful representatives in the clergy and also parishioners and people who are believers. They have true faith and they approach their roles or their positions as representatives of being faithful with a genuine interest to spread wisdom and to be a good person and to do good in the community. Just like there are wonderful politicians out there who go into politics for all the right reasons. However, they may want to improve the world and to make life better for everyone, whether it be their parishioners or their constituents. But just like politics, which is essentially corrupt, so is religion. They're both essentially very flawed entities, and they're irreparably flawed, or irreparably, I think is the way you pronounce it, flawed. And so unfortunately, even these beautifully well-intended people who as individuals may be flawless, they end up moving into an environment that is highly, highly flawed and terribly corrupt. And so it becomes very difficult to tell good from bad. And just by being part of the entity, the greater entity, it kind of tarnishes their reputation, even though they might be very well intended. It's very hard to tell good from bad. So this week, I actually did a tarot card reading on the Ellie Dreams Unlimited channel, and I asked about the rapture. And this is the rapture that Christians say will occur during the end of days. And the way that the Bible describes it is something along the lines of two brothers will be standing side by side, and a moment in time will come where one of them vanishes and the other one remains. And this is this is a sign of there being a difference between the righteous believers who are devoted to God and to Jesus Christ, and those who are not. They have not embodied this Christ. They have not taken Christ to be their Savior. They don't give themselves over to God, and therefore they remain on earth. And evangelical Christians believe that this is the vanishing. This is where the righteous Christians will be delivered unto God early, before the Antichrist shows up, and they will go to live with him in his kingdom for eternity. And then everyone else who isn't as righteous will remain here to have to endure the reign of the Antichrist for 1,000 years or so, and to witness the war between God, Christ and the Antichrist. And then ultimately they will be delivered unto God as well, because everyone will eventually, except they have to suffer first. Well, the cards were really interesting because they responded a little bit differently. They said that, yes, the rapture appears to be a thing that kind of is going to happen, but it's going to be a little bit different than what appears in the Bible. And as per usual, the Bible has a tendency to interpret things in a certain way, and often when you scratch the surface, it turns out to be something different. The way that the cards described it is that as part of our evolution, described by, the Helena Blavatskys of the world, and thinking in terms of what I was saying earlier about the cycles of humanity and the fact that we transition through a process which is cyclical. And if you believe Helena Blavatsky, we do a cycle of around 250 million years here on Earth. We complete that cycle, and then, which could consist of multiple cycles of reincarnation and ages and things like that. And then we transition and do it all over again in a different place, in a different planet, in a different way. Well, as we ascend out of our current existence, those who have raised their consciousness are likely to rise into a fifth dimensional reality. And they will do that by following things like the secret Gospels, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, and things where it's about learning to trust in yourself, learning to see the light to embody, I think it's to recognize that you are God, that each of us is God, and that Christ is inside us. Christ is an element of something that is our consciousness, that is our level of awareness, and it is the light. He is an it, or is an embodiment of something that is within us, and each of us has direct access to it. We don't need a priest, we don't need an intermediary. And once we recognize that, we become empowered, and we become ascendant, and we rise ultimately into the fifth dimensional reality. But because the fifth dimension is out of view from those who live in the third dimension, we will appear to vanish. Those of us who make it and those of us who don't will be stuck back in 3D, and will have to endure 3D without those of us who've evolved into the fifth dimension. And that may actually be the rapture. That the rapture is indeed a vanishing of one of the two brothers that stand side by side, because one of them has evolved through conscious enlightenment and empowerment by raising their awareness and looking within. And they will rise into a new dimension that is not perceivable by the third dimension. And I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't even considered that. And a subscriber asked me to do the reading, and so I did it, and the cards appeared to concur that that is the case. And so if that is the case, then the Antichrist isn't actually a person. The Antichrist is an energy that opposes the energy of love or light or enlightenment. And what that means is that the church is actually preaching to people in such a way as to keep them unenlightened, by keeping them as far away from that simple truth as possible. And you kind of have to wonder why. To keep them focused on an old book about an evil alien called Yahweh, when in fact they should be looking inside themselves and learning to become more and more aware and conscious by searching for answers than from multiple sources than just from a single storybook about this fellow called Yahweh. And then chapter 2 being the book of the New Testament. But also there's something in the New Testament that is interesting too, and we can throw that into the mix as well. And that is that the New Testament talks about the beast that rises from the sea with 7 heads. And I have asked in maybe it was last week's episode whether that could possibly be the rise of advanced technology. Because technology is something as advanced as it is, and it can rise and become powerful. It can become something that we worship, right? Like being glued to our mobile phones could have been seen by the ancient world as being a form of worship, where we're stuck with our head in our mobile phone, or with our head in our television, or sitting on the internet and things like that, or relying on artificial intelligence to run our lives and things like that, or taking the advice from artificial intelligence. All of that could be forms of worship. And the thing about artificial intelligence or technology is that it may be powerful and it may be advanced, but it's not sentient, which means it cannot appreciate the Christ consciousness. If you put in a Google search for Christ consciousness, you'll get lots of answers, but all it's doing is parroting off things that it's heard. It isn't the same as embodying it. And I do kind of wonder, well, that was kind of what I speculated about in last week's show. And if that's the case, then the beast that rises from the sea that has 7 heads, is it possible that that could be 7 heads of 7 technological giants? So I did a Google search this morning, actually, and I asked, how many technological giants are there in the world? And Google responded and gave me a list. And it said Microsoft, Meta, Google, Tesla, Nvidia, Amazon, and Apple. 7. There are 7 technological giants. Is that a coincidence or what? 7 technological giants. Just like the beast with 7 heads that appears in the book of Revelation. And 5 of those technological giants have just invested $1 million each to Donald Trump's inauguration as of today. Even Mark Zuckerberg from Meta fame, who gave Donald Trump nothing for presidential efforts and campaigning in 2016 or in 2020, now in 2025 for his inauguration, he has given him $1 million. And of course, those 5 were Microsoft, Meta, Google, Amazon, and Apple. Tesla, owned by Elon Musk, basically is the 6th and basically funded the 2024 presidential campaign in its majority. And the only one left is Nvidia. Nvidia has not folded yet. As far as I can see at the time of recording today's show, it's still waiting. I'm still waiting for it to provide money directly to Donald Trump, unless there's something that I've missed, and it hasn't done that. Nvidia is a multi-shareholder entity, the primary shareholders being BlackRock and Vanguard. Nvidia has, however, as of today, because it was in today's news, has just invested $500 million in building a supercomputer in Israel this week. So I don't know whether that's a connection, and I don't know whether that's relevant. So if the book of Revelation's beast that comes from the sea with 7 heads is actually considered to be the Antichrist, and the 7 tech giants are represented by the 7 heads, this actually could be the ancient people's view of what appeared to be a beast. Because if something is rising that you don't recognize, and it hasn't got a sentient quality to it, and therefore cannot possibly embody the Christ consciousness, because it has no actual consciousness, then could it be translated as being a beast of some kind because it's not capable of being within the conscious element. I wonder about that. So we may have actually found a link there to the Antichrist element that is actually closely related to reality. And so if that's the case, then who is the false prophet? Is it one of the giant tech leaders? Or is it someone who invents or tries to push us into using a certain kind of advanced technology that will make it easier for us to trade or impossible to trade if we don't use it? It could become a mandatory trade thing. And so anyone who doesn't use it can't make a living. They can't buy or sell. Can you see? I'm talking about lots of disparate things today that I've covered on this show over the course of 47 different episodes. But can you see how they all converge together to demonstrate how the Bible, which is supposed to be the story of our origins, right? Not our oranges, the story of our origins. The Bible begins to make far more sense when you look at it outside of the religious teachings that we have been taught to understand. But it doesn't make any sense at all when you rely on it simply as it's been interpreted for religious purposes. But that's not all. I want to throw something else in here as well. We've got the Marian sightings that have been taking place for hundreds of years all over the world, maybe even thousands of years, but they've been documented really in the hundreds of years. This is where people who are desperate or mourning or in deep states of grief and loss, or even children of very pure heart, for example, and who are simply curious, they suddenly see a vision of a hovering, impossibly beautiful woman in the sky. And that woman invariably has a stark message about the fate of humanity. And she's always pleading with us to choose love over fear, to choose Christ over the Antichrist. For example, the children who encountered Our Lady of Fatima, I've done an episode talking about that, and that includes the 100, I think it was around 100,000 people who also saw the lady on her last appearance date, or the most recent sightings by Chris Bledsoe, that fellow that I mentioned at the beginning of the hour. And just for the record, I do actually believe Chris Bledsoe. I believe that he really did see a lady in white that he claims that he saw. And I do believe that his early account of the experiences that he had were genuine accounts. And she provided him with a warning that is very similar to those other Marian sightings of the vision of the shimmering lady dressed in white who is mournful about the direction of humanity and is pleading with us to be righteous, however we define righteous to be. To choose the Christ option, to choose the love option. But of course, it all depends on what Christ actually is. Whether we're supposed to follow a man or whether we're supposed to follow what he embodied, the essence of what he embodied. Because his flesh and blood may come and go, but there was something in him that was special, that was an example that all of us should aspire to. So is it that they're warning us to follow the teachings of a man who existed thousands of years ago? Or is it simply a message to trust what's inside us, to trust ourselves? Because everything we have inside us is human, and therefore it is complete and it needs nothing more than it already has. And once we trust ourselves, we can trust each other, or learn to trust each other. And once we do that, and once the dividing walls have crumbled, then everything will change and we will become stronger collectively and more united, and we will begin to ascend towards our future. Is that the message? And finally, I can't really complete this episode without throwing a little bit more in there when it comes to the whole disclosure and ET connection, because I've also been looking at that to see where it might be part of the mix, because it's all happening at the same time as everything else. There is something in the sky right now, particularly if you're in New Jersey, but there's something in the sky. People are claiming that it's happening all over the world. Mostly it seems to be focused on the United States. But I'm not going to say that it's not happening everywhere. I'm not everywhere at once, so I can't be sure. But there is definitely something happening in the sky. And yes, you've got the drone thing, which some people say is a psychological operation by the government or elements of power in order to prepare us for a forthcoming disclosure about, non-human intelligence. Or it might be there to hide a potential disclosure that is currently in progress, or maybe to prevent a future disclosure, so that there's so many things happening in the sky that we see more things we don't even care anymore. And so maybe it's trying to prepare us in a negative way so that we don't care about something that's revealed, because by the time it is revealed, we're just beyond it. We've been watching things hovering around for so long that we don't care anymore. And of course, alongside the drones, there are orbs that people are seeing, and the orbs are very much the same as the orbs that Chris Bledsoe has been filming every night outside his house, where he invites sometimes 100 people to his home to be able to look up and see them for themselves. Can you see how all of this appears to be happening at once? We're here on Earth, but Earth is only one of the billion planets out there in the infinite solar systems that exist. Some of the planets are advanced, some are probably not as advanced. We sit somewhere in that spectrum. And I doubt very much that all of these planets get along. All of the inhabitants of these planets, I doubt very much that they all get along. So when people talk about a galactic federation, for example, I wouldn't doubt that something like that exists, because wherever you have multiples of anything, you will always have some kind of a representation of those multiples. Some attempt to understand that framework and all get along and find ways to be a collective. But a collective of different species and races from different planets and solar systems and different degrees of consciousness and sentience and different value systems and belief systems and levels of advancement, I doubt very much that they're all going to get along. And so, nothing ever is that utopian. So when have you ever seen a group of people or a group of anything exist eternally and always get along? I just don't think it's possible. And so I believe that in the big scheme of everything that I've discussed today, which seems as though it's just been a hosh-posh of stuff, doesn't it? I think that some entities are good, some are not so good. Some of them want to help us, some want to own us, and possibly some of them may just want to eat us. I don't know. I mean, Yahweh is an example. He did love his child sacrifices. And for whatever it was that purpose was, to be able to burn children to give him pleasure would indicate that he probably had an appetite for young, tender meat of the human variety. And then on the other side of the spectrum, those Marian sightings would indicate that there's another type of entity that we perceive to be angelic, that comes to warn us to be mindful, to empower ourselves, and to be our own heroes rather than waiting for someone else to come and save us, and to harness our humanity collectively in ways that will be for the betterment of our own future, remembering that we are God, not some guy in the clouds. We are God. And we are the power behind the energy of our existence. We create our own reality collectively. And so if we fight against each other and if we hate each other, then we will create a perpetual energy field of hate and division around us that just feeds into fear and darkness, and nothing ever changes. But if we let go of our fear of within us and about those around us, and give service to one another and disclose ourselves to one another in ways that will help to foster this mutual trust, if we give each other a chance to let go in our own times, so that we can build a coalition of strength, then we can push that energy into something positive, into something wonderful. And of course, continuing to look for answers. So of course, I'm going to be coming back here every week to see if I can figure out the connecting dots and maybe bring them tighter together with every single episode. I am convinced so far that everything is happening at once, whether it be psychological, spiritual, political, or otherwise. It's all interwoven. These concepts of the angelic beings, of politics, of the beast from the Book of Revelation, from the ET disclosure question, everything. I think it's all interwoven into a single thing. And we don't have to understand it all today in order to be stronger and more enlightened. We just need to follow a handful of examples of our enlightenment that we've seen today and in the past. We need to just be a good person, to control the things that we can individually control. And that is to be a good person, to give service to others for lots of reasons. Firstly, to be able to help others to rise, to help others to live a better life, but also to help others to see who we are. Because when we give service to those people, they get to see us for how wonderful we really are. And then the fear just dissolves. You can't be afraid of someone who has shown you kindness and helped to lift you up. Particularly, regardless of their color or their gender or their socio-economic standing. If a person reveals themselves to you in a positive light, then you get to see them in that positive light. And then it becomes more and more difficult to be able to argue with yourself about why you should hate them. Looking inward for the answers, because it seems that the answers are inside us. And following the advice of the Stoics of the past, where they say that the inner strength prevails over anything that a tough guy could do to us. So, inner strength is transcendent. It transcends anything from the material plane, and muscles are simply a material substance. We need to transcend the tough guy element and move into this realm of inner strength, because that's what's going to help us to prevail. I recently, in fact, I think it was this morning, I was watching a show where this modern day kind of philosopher character was talking to one of the cable hosts about how Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela were each examples of individuals who brought together the common day people so that they could congregate and form a collective mindset and provide a mutual support system so powerful that it was able to overthrow the ruling forces that dominated the society within their reality. And this was a great example of how people who stick together can achieve anything that they set their collective mind to. And of course, seeking information that feeds the mind and the soul will also be helpful, and trying to stay away from things like clickbait that you think is going to entertain you, but actually really mostly just confuses you. And never ever stop that search for answers. And of course, returning here next week so that we can discover more about where we came from, where we are, and where we might be going. Us, our origins, and our future. My name is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. Don't forget, I've recently published a book. It's called Tarot Well Done. It's now available in paperback, large print paperback, hardback, ebook, and in a few weeks it will also be available on audio. How exciting is that? I've been working like a donkey. Thank you to everyone who is listening on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you are a weirdo like me and like watching and listening all kinds of weird and wacky stuff, then just go to live.kgradb.com and use promo code Ellie to get 30% off your KGRA subscription. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.